Hi guys, Katie here. So I feel like this week's going to be super long discussion, so I'm going to jump right into it. For chapter 5, question 1, upward communication, downward communication, lateral communication, and the rule of silence. Downward communication is that starts at the top of the organizational pyramid and is then transmitted down to lower level employees throughout the organization. People in positions of power get or have to determine how and what to communicate to the rest of the organization. Kahn states that there are 5 specific types of downward communication, including job instructions, rationale, procedures and practices, feedback, and indoctrination. Upward communication is basically the opposite of downward communication. So this communication that is filtered up the chain. This type of communication allows for frontline employees to be involved with decision making and voicing opinions. There are 4 types of upward communication: info or information about employees themselves, information about coworkers and their problems, organizational policies and procedures, and then information about specific tasks. The text states that critical upward communication should be added as a 5th type of upward communication. Lateral or horizontal communication is kind of like peer-to-peer communication. People on the same level of the organization are providing information to other people on that same level. 4 functions of horizontal communication are task coordination, problem solving, information sharing, and conflict resolution. I think there's both positives and negatives to lateral communication. Sometimes in lateral communication, it can feel as if somebody on your same level is telling you what to do, which sometimes doesn't rub people the right way. And I think there's also a lot of misinformation. People interpret things differently. So, it's like the game of telephone where one person interprets something wrong, relays it to the next person, then the next person relays it wrong to the next person, and so on. So, if the message has been predetermined and it's written down, then great. But there is definitely the possibility of misinterpretation or misinformation being spread through lateral communication. Employee silence is where employees intentionally or unintentionally withhold information that may be useful to someone else in the organization, in particular leaders. Morrison and Milliken say that this is due to management reactions and attitudes towards employees from previous suggestions and comments that maybe even relayed to them, how the manager reacted when those were relayed to them. 3 types of silence are, let's see here. Acquiescent silence comes from being disengaged. Defensive silence is silence used to prevent risk, and pro-social silence is used by employees to show cooperation. So pro-social would be like, if I don't necessarily agree with something, I'm just going to keep quiet about it and do it anyway. I can think of a lot of times where I've maybe expressed silence at work beyond the examples given in the book. I think there are times when maybe you're concerned about how your peers will react to something you say or do, especially if you work in a really catty environment with cliques, kind of put you in a precarious position sometimes. So I think silence sometimes goes beyond some of those things that are mentioned. There's also been a lot of times where it may feel pointless to speak about things. For example, in my current role, I have 600 patients that I support by myself, and I could probably work 80 hours a week without breaks and still not get my work done. It's been that way for 2 years since I've been in this role, and I've brought it up hundreds of times, and yet nothing changes or is resolved. We're just now to the point where they're allowing me to hire a part-time person to help me, and it's only a part-time person. So, it's does a squeaky wheel always get the grease? I don't know. I guess it kind of depends on every situation, but doesn't feel that way for me right now. Finally, on to question 2. So what are communication networks? What's the difference between formal and informal? How do they work? So on. Formal communication, as discussed previously, is upward, downward, and lateral. Formal communication has structure. It usually follows some sort of a path, whereas informal communication is kind of outside of that formal structure or hierarchy. Informal communication types include single strand, gossip, probability, and cluster. Single strand is most like the game of telephone that I talked about earlier, where a piece of information moves from one person to the next. Gossip is where one person gives information to multiple sources directly. Probability communication network is where one person transmits information to randomly selected people who take that information and do the same thing with it to other randomly selected people. And then cluster network is just like that, but with specific people in mind when they're transmitting. So pre-selected people. Some of the information transmitted through the grapevine is accurate and some of it is not, which can cause a lot of problems for organizations. When I hear the word grapevine, I kind of think of the rumor mill. So if you've ever been caught up in the rumor mill at work or in high school, that's probably not somewhere you want information being spread about you. Chapter 6 questions, I chose question 1, consider workplace culture, describe the organizational culture, functional, interpretive, critical, and postmodern approaches to understanding my current culture. So my current organization has a pretty great organizational culture beyond what I spoke about earlier. As a whole, our leaders embed, transmit, and teach culture like Sheen's model mentions on page 162. The leadership really tries to portray an approachable, open door style leadership. If you have a question or anything that you want to talk about, you won't be shunned away. I've sent emails to VPs without them, saying, "Who the heck are you?" Even though there's 5,000 people in my organization. So it's really nice to see leadership try to emulate that approachable demeanor with pretty much everybody in the organization, no matter what level you're on. The interpretive approach describes culture as something that varies from organization to organization. So if an outsider were to come into my organization and submerge themselves in the culture, I think that they would find that the culture is pretty unlike any other culture. We're pretty different, not only in our approach to our internal culture, but also our approach to healthcare and insurance and all that fun stuff. So I think that they would be in for something that they probably wouldn't see in other organizations. Critical and postmodern is listed as more of like an investigation and on how organizations promote reification and universalization. I don't think my organization really perpetuates managerial interests over other interests, but there is a sense of pushing out, the culture and the ideals of the organization and ensuring that everybody has that same mentality. So not necessarily managerial interests, but maybe interests of the patient, since we're healthcare. Each lens offers a different view of how the organization uses culture to reinforce the values and ideas that my employer wants the employees to withhold. And then I also chose question 3 using Sheen's organizational culture model. Sorry, I lost my place. Give a clear and rich discussion of your organization's culture. So Sheen explains that culture is created in an organization through culture embedding mechanisms. These mechanisms are what leaders choose to emphasize, measure, and control, such as how they react to key incidents. How leadership chooses to react has a primary impact on the organization's culture, and secondary mechanisms are more formal things like policies, procedures, documents, yada, yada. So I kind of discussed this a little bit earlier, but I feel like the leaders in my organization set a really good foundation for employees. They have had a phenomenal response to some of the recent political turmoil, the riots, racial injustices, COVID. They've really set the bar pretty darn high in my book as far as how you should treat humanity as a whole. They have a really good value set that they really try to push on everybody who works there. And they really have shown, some resilience and dedication as far as leadership goes and how they present to the rest of the organization. Basically, they just want everybody to care for everyone, and everyone is a human, including employers, patients, community partners, and people with varying political views. Very accepting of all people, LGBTQ and diversity friendly. They really perpetuate these ideas in their leadership styles and then the culture that they embed throughout the organization, through the way the leadership basically shows that to the staff and the staff to coworkers and so on, and to patients. So finally, question about the case study. So for chapter 5, I'm going to relate the case study. I think it's important to note that there's a lot of downward communication, even though at Worcester Manufacturing, they were really supportive and caring, and the wife, cooked dinners for everybody. I think that they really forgot to take into account their employees' thoughts and feelings. They didn't look to the employees to help solve the situation at all. And in addition to that, from chapter 5, I think the grapevine was something that could probably be related here. They these employees came in, they're lower level, none of them knew what was going on except for the fact that they'd finished their work early. And all of a sudden, there's these memos going up, and they're all going to talk to each other about that. And they're going to talk about how this is going to negatively impact them, and that's going to bring out more negativity in the people they're talking to, and it's just going to blow up, right? So that's why they had all these people coming into their offices complaining about how this is going to negatively impact them. For chapter 6 on page 155, it talks about supportive and defensive climates in problem orientation versus control. So managers' reactions to problems can be how they affect their employees. So problem orientation is when a manager uses a give and take approach to problem solving. That's where employees are involved in problem solving situation and coming up with strategies and so on. I don't think that they took this into account. The employees weren't involved, and management was very controlling the situation, so they created a defensive environment rather than a supportive environment. And, when employees are involved in problem-solving situations, you're bound to have a more supportive environment with employees who want to help problem solve rather than contribute to the problem, which is what they ran into. The employees were contributing to a bigger problem than a resolution. And then finally on page 158, structural perspective, where Gibb explains that a supportive climate is created when an individual is relieved of their anxieties. But in this scenario, I think kind of the opposite happened there. Instead of relieving these employees of their anxieties about potentially being laid off, they perpetuated and created more anxiety in their employees by coming up with this whole plan without anybody being involved in it. So that was it. I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. Sorry it was so long. I really tried to make it quick, but it didn't happen. Thanks.